Long before headlines and museums, the desert of southern Mesopotamia kept its secrets well. In the early years of the 20th century, as European expeditions cut trenches through ancient mounds, a small group of excavators uncovered clay fragments unlike the rest. These tablets were not grand inscriptions meant for kings or temples. They were broken, scorched, and buried beneath layers that suggested deliberate concealment rather than simple abandonment. At first glance, the markings seemed Sumerian, yet something felt wrong. Certain symbols appeared distorted, repeated in unfamiliar sequences, or combined in ways no standard lexicon could comfortably explain. Junior scholars whispered doubts in field tents while senior translators hesitated, revising notes again and again as if the language itself resisted clarity. What unsettled them most was context. These fragments were not found alongside administrative records or hymns, but isolated, wrapped in ash and rubble, as though someone long ago had tried to erase them from memory. Even the soil around them told a story of interruption, a moment when normal city life paused for something urgent and dangerous. Official reports downplayed the discovery, labeling the tablets incomplete and insignificant. Yet private correspondence paints another picture entirely. Letters speak of unease, of symbols that should not exist, and of narratives that contradicted accepted timelines. From the moment they surfaced, these fragments carried an unspoken warning, suggesting they were never meant to be read again, and that their return from the sand might come at a cost. Few understood what had truly emerged. As translations slowly took shape, one word kept reappearing where no one expected it. Buried within what should have been routine economic records and temple inventories was a name that carried weight far beyond mythology: Anunnaki. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed ordinary, another divine reference among many, but Assyriologists knew better. This was not a poetic flourish or a symbolic blessing. The placement was wrong. The tone was wrong. The Anunnaki were not invoked in prayer, nor praised in hymns. They were listed as authorities, decision-makers, and overseers. In some passages, offerings were not made to them, but accounted for by them, as if these beings functioned more like administrators than gods. This subtle distinction sent quiet shockwaves through academic circles. Even more troubling were descriptions tied to their arrival. The tablets spoke of descent, not metaphorical enlightenment, but physical movement from the sky to the ground. Words, usually reserved for storms or machinery, appeared alongside their name, suggesting force, sound, and controlled motion. Scholars debated endlessly whether these were metaphors stretched too far or something far older and literal. What unsettled everyone was consistency. Across fragments found miles apart, the Anunnaki appeared with the same attributes and authority. Myths can vary wildly, but records tend to repeat what is observed. That pattern alone terrified conservative historians everywhere, and no one said why for decades afterward, quietly. As researchers cross-checked excavation reports with museum inventories, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Catalog numbers recorded meticulously in field journals no longer matched the artifacts stored in collections. References existed to tablets that no one could physically locate. At first, this was dismissed as clerical error, the inevitable chaos of early archaeology, but the gaps were too precise, too selective. Entire sequences were missing, not random fragments, but tablets tied to specific layers and themes. Notes describe them in detail, their size, condition, even partial translations, yet the objects themselves had vanished somewhere between the desert and the archive. Crates arrived sealed only to be opened and found incomplete. No theft reports were filed, no public questions were asked. What made this absence more disturbing was what the missing tablets shared in common. They were not mundane tax records or grain tallies. They were the pieces that mentioned authority, origin, and oversight. The same unfamiliar terms, the same unsettling tone. It was as if someone knew exactly which parts of the story needed to disappear. Museum staff later recalled quiet instructions from above, requests to reorganize or reclassify certain items. Boxes were moved, labels changed, then silence. Over time, scholars learned not to ask about specific catalog numbers because doing so led nowhere productive and sometimes nowhere safe. History is often shaped by what survives, but here, absence itself told a story. These tablets were not lost to time or decay. They were removed, and once that realization settled in, a far darker question followed naturally: if pieces of humanity's oldest written record could simply vanish, who decided what the world was allowed to remember at all? Rather than igniting open debate, the tablets seemed to trigger an unspoken agreement across institutions. Silence. Conferences that once welcomed speculative discussion quietly removed related panels. Grant applications referencing the missing fragments were declined without explanation. Young researchers were advised gently but firmly to choose safer topics if they wished to build careers. Journal submissions met a similar fate. Papers were not publicly challenged or disproven. They were simply never published. Editors cited vague concerns about methodology or relevance, even when the work followed accepted academic standards. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The issue was not accuracy, but attention, and senior historians began to change their language. Where earlier notes hinted at disruption and uncertainty, later publications softened conclusions, reframing unsettling translations as metaphor or ritual exaggeration. Entire lines were omitted, footnotes vanished, and references to missing tablets faded from bibliographies. It was as if the academic record itself was being slowly rewritten. Behind closed doors, questions persisted, not about what the tablet said, but about who had the authority to decide they were unworthy of discussion. No official directive was ever found, no memo ordering suppression. Instead, control manifested through incentives and consequences, subtle enough to deny, effective enough to endure. Silence, it turned out, did not require conspiracy. It required alignment. And once enough institutions agreed, the mystery of the tablets became something far more unsettling, a lesson in how easily history can be guided by the quiet removal of curiosity. Few noticed when questions stopped. As translations deepened, a disturbing pattern emerged that could no longer be dismissed as poetic exaggeration. The beings described in the tablets did not behave like distant, abstract gods. They argued, they negotiated, they complained of exhaustion and shortage. Some demanded obedience, while others rebelled against authority. This was not the language of myth meant to inspire worship. It was the language of governance. The Anunnaki were portrayed as hierarchical figures, divided by rank and responsibility. Certain individuals issued commands. Others carried out labor. There were disputes over resources, punishments for the disobedience, and councils convened to resolve conflict. These details unsettled historians because mythology rarely concerns itself with such administrative realism. Even more striking were references to physical needs. The text spoke of food, rest, and shelter. Offerings were not symbolic gestures of devotion, but provisions required for survival. The Anunnaki depended on infrastructure, supply chains, and labor output, much like any ruling class throughout human history. Most troubling of all were passages describing tools and processes. Mining operations were outlined with precision. Engineering projects were assigned and monitored. Authority was enforced not through miracles, but through control of knowledge and capability. Taken together, these descriptions forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The Anunnaki were not gods imagined by humans, but powerful beings remembered by them. Across multiple tablets, a recurring phrase appeared, translated loosely as "they came down from the heavens." At first, scholars treated this as conventional divine imagery, but the surrounding language complicated that assumption. The descent was described with noise, force, and heat. The sky did not open symbolically, it roared. Words normally used for storms or earthquakes were repurposed to describe arrival. Winds were violent, controlled, and directional. Light was blinding and sustained, not fleeting like lightning. The ground trembled beneath shining vessels that settled rather than struck. These were not metaphors that appeared once and vanished. They were repeated, consistent, and technical. What baffled researchers was the specificity. The tablets did not say the Anunnaki simply appeared. They traveled, they landed, they departed. Routes were implied, timelines were recorded. In some cases, scribes even noted the fear and chaos their arrival caused among local populations, as though witnessing something unprecedented. Mythology tends to blur detail over time, yet here the descriptions remained sharp. The same imagery surfaced across generations of scribes. For historians, this raised an unsettling question. If these accounts were purely symbolic, why did they read like eyewitness testimony? And if they were literal, why did ancient people possess language capable of describing technology they supposedly had never seen? Perhaps the most unsettling passages concerned humanity itself. The tablets did not describe humans as sacred creations born of divine love. Instead, they framed human origin as a response to crisis. The Anunnaki, burdened by labor and internal conflict, required assistance. The solution was not prayer, it was design. Humans were described as workers fashioned to relieve strain. The language was utilitarian, almost indifferent. There was no celebration of creation, no moral lesson, only efficiency. Tasks were assigned, output was measured, obedience was expected. This portrayal stripped away romance and replaced it with function. Even the process of creation felt disturbingly technical. References to mixing substances, shaping forms, and repeating failed attempts appeared in stark contrast to later theological narratives. Success was achieved through refinement, not miracle. The errors were corrected, but improvements were made. For viewers and historians alike, this reframing is deeply uncomfortable. It suggests that humanity's oldest origin story may not be spiritual metaphor, but operational record. If that is true, then faith, myth, and memory have been layered over something far colder, something closer to engineering than divinity, and far harder to reconcile with modern belief. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the implications of these tablets are profound. If literal, they rewrite humanity's origin as an engineered solution rather than divine creation. If symbolic, they remain oddly specific, uncomfortably detailed for mere allegory. Either interpretation destabilizes the foundations of history. Historians are trained to tolerate ambiguity, but this is different. The tablets sit at the very beginning of recorded civilization. They shape how later cultures understood gods, authority, and humanity's place in the world. Dangerous ambiguity at this level threatens every belief built on top of it. What unsettles scholars most is not what the tablets claim, but how resistant they are to clean dismissal. They refuse to be purely myth. They refuse to be easily literal. Instead, they exist in a liminal space that forces constant reevaluation. That tension alone is destabilizing. If humanity's earliest records carry unresolved questions about origin, power, and purpose, then certainty itself becomes fragile. Perhaps that is why these texts were sidelined rather than confronted, because once such questions are asked openly, they do not remain confined to ancient history. They echo forward, challenging everything that followed. The Knights Templar are often remembered as armored monks, riding into battle, sworn to protect pilgrims and defend holy ground. Yet this image hides a far stranger reality. From their earliest days, the Templars displayed an obsession that went beyond warfare. They collected manuscripts, studied languages, and preserved records with a discipline rivaling monasteries and royal courts alike. These were not merely soldiers of faith, they were archivists in armor. Their headquarters in Jerusalem was not chosen at random. Beneath the Temple Mount, one of the most archaeologically sensitive sites on Earth, the Templars were granted unprecedented access. Officially, they were fortifying their base. Unofficially, they were digging. Contemporary chroniclers mention tunnels, chambers, and artifacts brought up from below. Though details are conspicuously vague, what raises suspicion is not that the Templars excavated, but what they seemed interested in finding. They were less concerned with Christian relics and more drawn to objects predating biblical history. Ancient stones, inscriptions, and fragments that did not fit neatly into church doctrine drew their attention. This intellectual curiosity set them apart from other military orders. While their peers focused on conquest and defense, the Templars pursued something buried deeper than territory. Their strange interest suggests they were searching not just for holy objects, but for knowledge that predated faith itself, and perhaps threatened it. Accounts from the period hint that the Templars uncovered material that defied expectation. And these were not simple relics of Israelite worship, nor artifacts tied neatly to Solomon's temple. Instead, descriptions speak of texts written in unfamiliar scripts, fragments older than the city itself, preserved in hidden chambers, long sealed. Some chroniclers mention symbols that required translation by scholars far from Jerusalem. Others reference writings that did not align with Hebrew tradition at all. This has led some historians to speculate that the Templars stumbled upon records carried to the region long before biblical history began. The most unsettling possibility is geographic. What if these writings did not originate in the Levant at all? What if they traced back to Mesopotamia, to Sumer, where the earliest known writing emerged? Such a link would imply that knowledge older than Judaism and Christianity had been deliberately hidden beneath one of the most sacred sites in the world. If true, this discovery would have been explosive. It would suggest a continuity of hidden knowledge, passed through civilizations and concealed beneath layers of religion. The Templars, sworn to protect the church, may have realized they had uncovered something that challenged the very roots of the faith they served. No official inventory survives, no definitive description remains, only hints, contradictions, and silence, leaving modern historians to wonder whether Jerusalem offered the Templars not spiritual affirmation but dangerous revelation. Following their time in Jerusalem, the Templars changed, not gradually but dramatically. Within a generation, they became one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. Kings borrowed from them, nobles feared them, even the church treated them with caution. Their wealth alone does not explain this transformation. Other orders received donations and privileges, yet none achieved the same level of independence. The Templars answered only to the Pope, ignored local authority, and operated across borders with impunity. They built fortresses, developed banking systems, and moved resources with unmatched efficiency. More telling was their spiritual behavior. Accusations later surfaced that the Templars practiced unorthodox rituals and held beliefs inconsistent with church teaching. While many charges were likely fabricated, the persistence of such rumors suggests a real divergence had occurred. Something had shifted at the core of the order. Confidence replaced obedience, certainty replaced deference. It was as if the Templars believed they possessed knowledge that made earthly authority irrelevant. Wealth can buy influence, but it cannot erase fear. Whatever empowered the Templars seemed to place them psychologically beyond control, and that terrified those who relied on faith as the foundation of power. If the Templars had learned that humanity's origins were manipulated rather than divinely ordained, the implications would have been catastrophic. Faith depends not only on belief, but on narrative. Remove the narrative and belief fractures. Such knowledge could not remain contained. The Templars were disciplined, but they were human. Curiosity spreads, doubt multiplies. If this information escaped the inner circle, it could undermine the authority of the church itself. Not through rebellion, but through quiet disbelief. This may explain the urgency of what followed. The sudden move against the Templars was ruthless and coordinated, suggesting fear rather than justice. Accusations were chaotic, contradictory, and secondary to the outcome. Total destruction of the order and seizure of its assets. Perhaps the trials were never about heresy. Perhaps they were about containment, eliminating an organization that knew too much before that knowledge could destabilize centuries of carefully constructed belief. If that is the case, then the fall of the Templars was not a tragedy of power, but a preventative act, a final attempt to bury a truth already unearthed once before. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, information moved slowly and predictably. Kings answered to emperors, bishops answered to archbishops, and military orders were expected to obey local rulers. Yet the Knights Templar appear to have violated this structure in a way few dared to question. Records suggest that certain Templar leaders bypassed monarchs entirely and communicated directly with Rome, addressing the papacy itself without intermediaries. This alone was extraordinary. Papal audiences were rare and carefully controlled. For the Templars to command such access implies that what they carried was not routine correspondence, but intelligence of exceptional gravity. These were not requests for funding or protection. They were reports. Hints appear in fragmented letters and later references to sealed messages delivered under oath. The tone, described indirectly by contemporaries, was urgent rather than deferential. Whatever the Templars had uncovered was framed not as speculation, but as discovery, something demanding immediate theological consideration. The church, which thrived on narrative stability, was suddenly confronted with information that could not be ignored or easily dismissed. If the Templars believed they had unearthed knowledge predating Christianity itself, Rome would have been the only authority capable of deciding its fate. And what remains unclear is whether these reports were welcomed or feared. But the fact that they existed at all suggests that the Vatican became aware of something long before the public ever had a chance to ask questions. And once knowledge reaches Rome, it rarely leaves unchanged. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is often described as the memory of Western civilization, yet large portions of it remain inaccessible. Entire collections are sealed, not for years, but for centuries. Official explanations cite preservation or cataloging concerns, but historians know that these reasons do not apply uniformly. Requests to access certain medieval documents are denied without justification. Scholars are redirected, delayed, or quietly discouraged from pursuing specific lines of inquiry. The deeper the subject reaches into origins, authority, and heresy, the more resistant the archive becomes. This secrecy has fueled suspicion for generations. Why would a religious institution dedicated to truth restrict access to its own history, especially when that history intersects with the earliest records of humanity and belief? The absence of transparency invites speculation, and speculation thrives where silence prevails. Some historians believe the sealed sections contain correspondence between the Vatican and the Templars, records of discoveries deemed too destabilizing for public release. Others suggest translations of ancient texts that never entered official doctrine. What unites these theories is a sense of fear, not fear of invasion or scandal, but fear of destabilization. If certain truths challenge the theological foundation of the church, locking them away becomes an act of preservation. The archive, then, is not just storage. It is a gatekeeper of reality. Among the more puzzling details uncovered by modern researchers is the sudden appearance of Sumerian expertise within the Vatican. During periods when the language had no liturgical or doctrinal relevance, select scholars were trained to read it fluently. This investment makes little sense on the surface. Sumerian is not a language of scripture for Christianity. It offers no direct support to biblical narrative. Training scholars in it would have required resources, time, and purpose. Yet records indicate precisely that effort was made. Why would a Christian institution devote itself to decoding pagan tablets? The only plausible explanation is a necessity. Someone needed to understand texts that could not be translated externally or safely shared. Outsourcing such work would risk exposure. The Vatican has long preferred internal scholarship when dealing with sensitive material. If ancient tablets connected to humanity's origins or challenged divine creation narratives, understanding them privately would be essential. And this linguistic focus suggests the church was not merely aware of the tablets, but actively engaging with them, not as mythology, but as data requiring interpretation. And that raises a deeper question. Once translated, what conclusions were drawn and why were they never shared? The silence surrounding this effort speaks louder than any published work. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Templars did not simply report their discoveries, they surrendered them. Some historians believe that physical tablets, fragments, or copies were handed directly to Vatican authorities, disappearing into the archive forever. This would explain the missing artifacts, the sealed documents, and the urgency with which the Templars were later dismantled. If the Vatican possessed the original materials, it would control both interpretation and dissemination. Handing over such knowledge would have placed the Church in an impossible position. To reveal it risked theological collapse. To destroy it risked erasing history. To conceal it offered stability at the cost of truth. If the tablets remain hidden, they represent not just suppressed artifacts, but an unresolved reckoning, a moment when the guardians of faith were forced to choose between doctrine and discovery. Whether the Templars complied willingly or under pressure remains unknown, but if knowledge of humanity's origins passed into Vatican hands, then history as we know it is incomplete by design. And once knowledge is locked away at that level, it does not disappear. It waits. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, something unprecedented unfolded across France. At the exact same hour, Templar commanders were arrested in cities, villages, and fortresses hundreds of miles apart. The precision of the operation revealed months of preparation, secrecy, and coordination at the highest levels of power. This was not a reaction to sudden evidence. It was an execution of a decision already made. The charges brought against the Templars were shocking, yet strangely hollow. Heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, and obscene rituals were alleged, but rarely defined with clarity. Each accusations varied wildly from one region to another, as if the goal was not truth, but justification. The crimes sounded severe enough to horrify the public, yet vague enough to avoid scrutiny. What troubled later historians was the speed. No thorough investigation preceded the arrests. No open inquiry allowed the Templars to respond. Guilt was assumed, not proven. It felt less like a trial and more like containment, a sudden move to neutralize an organization deemed too dangerous to exist. The timing itself carried symbolism. Friday the 13th would echo through history as a day of misfortune, but for the Templars it marked something far darker. The moment when power moved to silence knowledge rather than confront it. In the weeks that followed, confessions poured in. Many Templars admitted to crimes that baffled theologians and contradicted church doctrine. Some claim they denied Christ. Others described secret rituals involving idols or forbidden words. Yet these confessions lacked consistency, logic, and theological coherence. Torture was widely used, a fact later acknowledged even by church authorities. Under such conditions, truth becomes fragile. Men will say anything to stop pain, but what unsettles historians is not merely that confessions were forced, but that some seemed strangely symbolic. Certain statements reference knowledge rather than belief, obedience rather than worship, silence rather than faith. A few confessions hinted at secrets revealed only to the initiated, truths considered too dangerous for the unprepared. These fragments have led some scholars to wonder whether the Templars were not confessing to heresy, but indirectly acknowledging possession of forbidden knowledge. If so, the confessions served a dual purpose. Publicly, they justified condemnation. Privately, they acknowledged something real, something that could not be spoken openly. The Church, in turn, accepted these admissions without probing too deeply, as if both sides understood the limits of what could be said aloud. Truth, in that moment, was not something to be revealed. It was something to be buried beneath guilt and fear. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the trials is what they omitted. There was no discussion of excavations beneath the Temple Mount, no mention of ancient texts, relics, or discoveries. The Templars were accused of spiritual crimes, not archaeological ones. This absence is striking because such discoveries would have provided motive, context, and explanation. Yet neither prosecutors nor defendants introduced them. It was as if an unspoken agreement existed. Some subjects were not to enter the record. Court transcripts focus on ritual and belief, never on knowledge, never on what the Templars might have learned or uncovered. The silence suggests fear, not ignorance. Everyone involved may have understood that acknowledging such discoveries would destabilize not just the Templars, but the Church itself. By keeping the trials narrowly framed, authorities ensured that the narrative remained controllable. Heresy could be condemned. Knowledge could not. Once spoken publicly, it would escape containment. The courtrooms echoed with accusations, yet the most important subject remained untouched. What the Templars knew was never debated. And in that silence, historians hear the loudest evidence of all. After the executions and dissolutions, the Templars' physical presence vanished with astonishing speed. Properties were seized, libraries emptied, records disappeared. What little documentation survived was scattered, fragmented, and often contradictory. This erasure went beyond political necessity. Other fallen orders left archives, correspondence, and artifacts. The Templars left almost nothing. Their history became a void, filled later by speculation and myth. Yet absence does not mean destruction. Some records likely survived, transferred quietly to church custody or private collections. Knowledge rarely disappears completely. It changes hands. The systematic removal of Templar documentation suggests intent. Someone understood the value of what was being erased. Not wealth, but information, the kind that could not be allowed to circulate freely. Today, historians piece together the story from gaps rather than texts, from missing pages rather than surviving ones. And those gaps tell a consistent story. The Templars were not destroyed for what they believed, but for what they knew. Silence followed their fall, but silence is not emptiness. It is storage. And whatever was stored away has never truly stopped haunting history. At the heart of the crisis lay a question no institution built on certainty could safely confront. If humanity was engineered, deliberately shaped to serve a purpose, then where did divine creation truly begin? The Church's doctrine rested on the belief that humans were formed by God's will, imbued with inherent spiritual meaning. The tablets suggested something far more unsettling: origin without sanctity. This was not a minor theological disagreement. It struck at the foundation of identity, morality, and authority. If humans were designed as laborers, then sin, salvation, and divine intention required complete reinterpretation. The Church could debate symbolism endlessly, but the problem was not interpretation alone, it was implication. To acknowledge even the possibility of engineered origins would invite chaos. Faith systems depend on continuity. Break the origin story, and every doctrine built upon it begins to wobble. For centuries, the Church had defined humanity's place in the universe. These tablets threatened to redefine it entirely. The dilemma was not whether the tablets were true, but whether truth itself could be afforded. The Church did not need certainty to be endangered. It needed doubt, and doubt, once released, cannot be recalled. Faced with this, the Vatican stood at a crossroads. To reveal would be to destabilize belief. To deny would invite eventual exposure, and to remain silent offered a third path, one that preserved structure at the cost of transparency. For an institution tasked with guiding souls, the choice was unbearable. To many modern observers, suppression appears inherently malicious. Yet within the Vatican, it may have been framed as responsibility. Some argue the decision to bury the tablets was not driven by power alone, but by fear of collapse. Civilizations are fragile. Belief holds them together. The Church had witnessed what happens when faith fractures, schisms, wars, revolutions. Knowledge does not exist in isolation. It reshapes societies. If humanity's origin story was destabilized, the consequences would not be academic. They would be existential. From this perspective, suppression becomes preservation. By locking away destabilizing truths, the Vatican may have believed it was protecting humanity from itself. Not every truth, they might argue, is meant for every era. This logic is deeply unsettling, yet internally consistent. Institutions often justify control by invoking protection. The danger lies in deciding who gets to know and who does not. The tablets represented a truth that could not be integrated into doctrine without tearing it apart, so they were removed from discourse entirely. Not disproven, not debated, simply excluded. In doing so, the church preserved continuity, but at a cost. Truth became conditional, knowledge became hierarchical, and history became curated rather than explored. The decision echoes forward, shaping not only belief, but the limits of inquiry itself. Despite suppression, some believe traces of forbidden knowledge still surface subtly. In cathedrals, manuscripts, and papal architecture, strange motifs appear that do not align neatly with Christian symbolism. Winged figures descending from the sky, beings emerging from clouds in vessels of light, forms that resemble watchers rather than angels. Individually, these images can be dismissed as artistic variation. Collectively, they raise questions. Why do certain motifs resemble descriptions found in Sumerian tablets rather than biblical scripture? Why do some depictions emphasize observation and authority over salvation and mercy? Art has long been a language of indirect expression. What cannot be spoken can be symbolized. Some scholars suggest that knowledge deemed too dangerous for doctrine may have survived in imagery, encoded rather than explained. If true, this would suggest not total suppression, but controlled acknowledgement, a way to preserve memory without empowering understanding. The knowledge remains visible, but inaccessible. Whether coincidence or intent, these symbols linger. They provoke unease precisely because they resist explanation. They hint at something beneath accepted narratives, something watching from the margins of belief. If the Vatican sought to erase all traces, it failed. If it sought to soften them, it succeeded. Either way, the symbols remain, quietly challenging those who notice them to ask why they exist at all. Choosing silence over revelation carries consequences that unfold slowly. When an institution withholds truth, it shapes not only belief, but curiosity. Questions become dangerous. Exploration becomes suspicion. History shows that suppressed knowledge rarely stays buried forever. It resurfaces fragmented, distorted, and weaponized. By delaying confrontation, institutions often magnify eventual impact. If the Vatican chose silence to preserve civilization, it may have unknowingly ensured future instability. Doubt festers in secrecy. Speculation thrives in absence. What might have been debated openly becomes mythologized and extreme. The cost of knowing is heavy, but the cost of not knowing may be heavier still. Generations inherit unanswered questions without context, forced to fill gaps with fear or fantasy. Perhaps history is already living with the consequences of that choice. A world where origin stories conflict, where trust in authority erodes, and where ancient mysteries return again and again, refusing resolution. Silence preserved order, but not peace. And as long as the truth remains locked away, it will continue to echo through history, not as knowledge, but as unease. In the modern era, the danger was no longer execution or imprisonment. It was erasure. Several researchers who dared to pursue unconventional interpretations of the Anunnaki tablets found their careers quietly derailed. These were not fringe theorists operating outside academia. They were credentialed linguists, archaeologists, and historians working within established institutions. At first, the resistance was subtle. Grant proposals were rejected without detailed explanation. Conference invitations stopped arriving. Collaborative projects dissolved. Colleagues who once encouraged debate suddenly became distant, advising caution and career realism. No accusations were made openly. No rules were broken explicitly. What these scholars shared was not a conclusion, but a line of inquiry. They questioned whether the Anunnaki descriptions were purely symbolic. They asked why administrative language appeared where myth should have been. They explored the implications rather than dismissing them. Over time, a pattern emerged. Those who treated the tablet strictly as metaphor thrived. Those who probed deeper stagnated. Some shifted focus entirely. Others left academia altogether, publishing independently or retreating into silence. The most unsettling aspect was how ordinary the process felt. No dramatic censorship, no official bans, just a slow withdrawal of opportunity. The message was clear without being spoken. Certain questions were acceptable, others were not worth the cost. In this environment, curiosity became a liability, and history once again narrowed itself to what was considered safe to ask. As decades passed, translations of the Sumerian tablets evolved. That alone is normal. Language interpretation improves over time, but careful comparisons between early translations and modern editions reveal something more troubling. Lines present in earlier work are missing entirely. Others are softened, rephrased, or reframed to remove ambiguity. References to authority become symbolic hierarchy. Descriptions of descent are recast as spiritual metaphor. Technical language is replaced with poetic abstraction. Each change appears reasonable in isolation. Together, they alter the tone and implication of the text. Early translators often worked closer to the raw material, less constrained by institutional pressure. Their notes express uncertainty and discomfort. Later versions present confidence, clarity, and theological compatibility. The mystery fades, replaced by reassurance. Critics argue this reflects academic refinement. Supporters claim it removes speculative bias, yet the direction of change is consistent. Ambiguity disappears. Discomfort is resolved. Dangerous questions dissolve into safe interpretations. What is lost in the process is not accuracy, but possibility. Translation is not neutral. It is shaped by context, expectation, and consequence. When certain meanings carry risk, alternatives become attractive. The result is a sanitized record, a version of the past that aligns neatly with present belief. And once redaction enters translation, history itself becomes an edited document, reflecting not only what was written, but what is permitted to be understood. Occasionally, fragments of private correspondence surface that illuminate what public records conceal. Letters between scholars, administrators, and external authorities reveal pressure applied quietly but persistently. The language is careful, diplomatic, and unmistakable. Phrases like avoid speculative interpretations and maintain academic responsibility appear repeatedly. No one orders censorship outright. Instead, concern is expressed for reputation, funding stability, and institutional relationships. The implication is clear. Certain interpretations create problems. Some letters suggest direct involvement from religious institutions. Others hint at political considerations tied to cultural stability. In each case, the concern is not factual error, but impact. What might happen if certain ideas gained traction? These communications rarely deny the existence of anomalies. They acknowledge them, then advise restraint. Questions are reframed as distractions. Curiosity is recast as irresponsibility. What makes these letters chilling is their tone: calm, rational, reasonable. Control is exercised not through force, but through guidance. Scholars are not silenced. They are redirected. In doing so, institutions maintain plausible deniability. No conspiracy is required, only shared interest in stability. yet the effect is the same. Inquiry narrows, discourse contracts, and history becomes shaped by caution rather than exploration. The letters reveal not fear of falsehood, but fear of consequence, and that distinction changes everything. Taken individually, each incident seems minor: a rejected paper, a revised translation, a cautious email, but when viewed together, they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. Control does not always announce itself. Often it whispers. Across disciplines and decades, the same boundaries appear. Question myth, but not memory. Analyze language, but not implication. Study the past, but do not let it disrupt the present. This pattern suggests coordination without conspiracy, alignment without orders. Institutions respond similarly because they face similar risks. Truth is not suppressed because it is false, but because it is destabilizing. Historians are trained to seek patterns, to connect dots across time and context. When they apply that skill here, the conclusion is uncomfortable. Knowledge about the Anunnaki is not merely controversial, it is managed. What frightens modern scholars is not the idea itself, but the reaction to it. If the tablets were harmless myth, there would be no need for such careful containment. Dismissal would suffice. Instead, the story repeats. Curiosity meets resistance. Inquiry meets silence. And history remains incomplete. At some point, coincidence becomes explanation, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. If the tablets are read literally rather than symbolically, their descriptions become deeply unsettling. They reference devices and processes that appear wildly out of place in the ancient world, right? Weapons are described that emit concentrated force rather than blades or arrows. Energy is harnessed, directed, and released with precision. These are not the tools of mythic heroes. They resemble mechanisms. Some passages speak of altering life itself, of combining substances, refining forms, and correcting flaws through repeated attempts. The language mirrors experimentation rather than magic. Success follows failure, improvement follows error. And these are hallmarks of technology, not theology. Even more disturbing are references to movement beyond Earth. The tablets describe ascent and descent not as spiritual journeys, but as physical travel. Objects rise, circle, and return. The sky is treated as a space to be navigated, not merely inhabited by gods. Critics argue that modern readers project contemporary ideas onto ancient texts, yet the problem remains consistency. These descriptions appear repeatedly across regions and generations, using similar language and structure. If they were metaphors, they were remarkably technical ones. Technology before time challenges our assumptions about progress. It suggests that advanced knowledge may not move linearly forward, but cyclically, rising and falling with civilizations. If true, humanity may not be discovering new ideas, but rediscovering old ones, and that possibility raises an uncomfortable question. If such technology existed once, where did it go? And who decided it should not be remembered? Perhaps the most destabilizing idea contained in the tablets is the portrayal of humanity itself. Humans are not celebrated as sacred beings, created for love or moral purpose. They're introduced as a solution, a response to a problem. The Anunnaki, burdened by labor and conflict, required assistance. Humanity was designed to fill that gap. This framing strips creation of romance and replaces it with intent. Humans exist because they were needed. The language is telling. There is no awe, no reverence, only function. Tasks are assigned. Expectations are set. Obedience is implied. Humanity's value is measured by productivity rather than divinity. This single shift reframes everything. Religion, morality, and purpose take on new meanings. If humans were created to serve, then freedom, rebellion, and self determination become acts of defiance rather than destiny. Such a view is profoundly uncomfortable. It challenges not only faith, but identity. People want to believe they are chosen, loved, and meaningful by design. The tablets suggest design without affection. Even if symbolic, the idea lingers. Why would ancient cultures imagine themselves as engineered servants unless that idea came from somewhere? Myths often glorify humanity. These texts do the opposite. If humanity began as a project, then history is not a story of ascent, but of emancipation, and that realization would change how we see ourselves forever. Some of the most cryptic passages in the tablets describe departure. The Anunnaki withdraw from daily involvement, leaving governance to humans, yet the language implies absence without abandonment. Observation replaces control. References appear to watchers, overseers who monitor from afar. They no longer rule directly, but they remain aware. The earth becomes something like a managed environment left to develop under supervision. This idea echoes across cultures: watchers, angels, sky gods, observers, different names, similar roles, entities who see but do not intervene openly. The consistency is unsettling. If the Anunnaki never fully left, then their influence may be indirect, through culture, belief, and myth rather than presence. Humanity grows, but within boundaries set long ago. Such a concept explains the persistence of certain fears and fascinations. The sky as origin, the heavens as a home of authority, the sense of being watched embedded deep in human psychology. Whether literal or symbolic, the idea refuses to disappear. It suggests that the relationship between humanity and its creators, real or imagined, did not end. It evolved. If observation continues, then the question is not when they will return, but whether they ever truly left, and what that means for a species that believes it is alone. When people imagine ancient visitors, they often fear invasion, conquest, destruction. Yet the deeper fear may be far quieter: realization. If the tablets are literal, then humanity's origin, purpose, and autonomy must be reconsidered. That realization would not come with fire from the sky, but with internal collapse. Belief systems would fracture, authority would weaken, identity would shift. This is the fear that controls the narrative. Not that something will arrive, but that something will be understood. Knowledge is more disruptive than force. Institutions manage this fear by framing the tablets as myth, fantasy, or fringe theory. Not because the ideas are ridiculous, but because they are destabilizing. Dismissal is easier than confrontation. Realization cannot be contained once it spreads. It changes how people see themselves and their place in the universe. It removes comfort without offering replacement. Perhaps this is why the story has been softened, delayed, and obscured, not to protect people from danger, but to protect meaning itself. Because if humanity was not born of divine intention, but engineered necessity, then the greatest threat is not invasion from above. It is awakening from below. Throughout modern history, the Anunnaki narrative follows a strange and predictable rhythm. It resurfaces during moments of upheaval, curiosity, or discovery, only to be swiftly dismissed and pushed back into obscurity. New translations appear. Old texts are re-examined. Questions briefly gain traction. Then the cycle resets. This pattern has repeated for over a century. Each generation rediscovers fragments of the same story, and reacts with the same mixture of fascination and rejection. Scholars flirt with possibility, media briefly amplifies it, and institutions move quickly to reassert boundaries. The story is labeled fringe, speculative, or misunderstood. What makes this cycle unusual is its persistence. Most discredited ideas fade, they lose relevance, they stop attracting serious attention. The Anunnaki narrative does the opposite. It returns stronger, reframed by new language, new technology, and new cultural anxieties. Every rediscovery introduces the same tension. The texts are ancient, verifiable, and real. The interpretations are unsettling. Rather than resolving that tension, society chooses dismissal. Yet dismissal never lasts. Curiosity regenerates. New readers encounter the same anomalies and ask the same forbidden questions. Each cycle leaves behind traces, fragments of doubt that accumulate over time. The story's refusal to disappear suggests it is anchored to something deeper than speculation. It behaves less like fiction and more like memory, resurfacing when conditions allow, retreating when resistance becomes overwhelming, and that alone raises suspicion. Ideas without substance do not require repeated suppression. They die naturally. This one does not, right? While academia resists the Anunnaki narrative, popular culture embraces it quietly. Films, television, video games, and novels explore ancient visitors, engineered humanity, and watchers from the sky with remarkable consistency. These ideas are presented as entertainment safely distanced from reality, yet repetition shapes perception. When themes recur across media, they become familiar, acceptable, normalized. Audiences absorb them without confrontation, conditioned to see them as imaginative rather than threatening. This cultural seepage is subtle but powerful. Concepts once considered shocking are now common tropes. Advanced beings seeding life, gods as misunderstood visitors, humanity as a designed species. These ideas circulate freely, stripped of historical context, but intact in essence. What is striking is how closely some narratives mirror ancient texts. The parallels are often dismissed as coincidence or creative borrowing. Yet the accuracy of certain details raises questions. Where does the inspiration truly come from? Popular culture functions as a buffer. It allows exploration without belief, curiosity without commitment. In doing so, it keeps the ideas alive while diffusing their impact. Ancient truths, if they exist, no longer arrive as revelation. They arrive as stories, and stories bypass defenses that facts cannot. If humanity is being exposed to unsettling ideas gradually, fiction is the safest delivery system. It prepares the mind without demanding acceptance. Whether intentional or not, modern media has become the most effective archive of forbidden questions. Some researchers believe this gradual resurfacing is not accidental. They argue that controlled exposure allows societies to adapt without collapse. Truth delivered slowly becomes manageable. Shocking ideas introduced as fiction lose their power to destabilize. From this perspective, the Anunnaki narrative is being disclosed incrementally, not through official channels, but through culture. Each generation becomes slightly more comfortable with ideas that once would have shattered belief systems. Others argue the process is organic, a form of cultural memory resurfacing when conditions allow. Ancient ideas embedded deep in myth and psychology emerge repeatedly because they were never fully erased. Both explanations lead to the same conclusion. The story survives because it resonates. It fits too neatly into unanswered questions about origin, purpose, and identity. If disclosure is controlled, it implies awareness at the highest levels. If it is accidental, it implies something even stranger, that humanity remembers more than it consciously knows. In either case, the pattern suggests preparation rather than randomness. Sudden revelation causes panic. Gradual familiarity creates acceptance. Perhaps the tablets were never meant to be revealed all at once. Perhaps understanding must be earned, not given. And perhaps humanity is being slowly guided toward a realization it once could not survive. The question is not whether exposure is happening, but why it follows such a careful pace. At the center of every dismissal lies a question no authority ever addresses directly. If the Anunnaki story is pure fiction, why work so hard to suppress it? Why manage translations, discourage inquiry, and seal archives? False ideas usually collapse under scrutiny. They do not require silence. They invite debate. Suppression implies risk, not error. The effort invested in containment suggests the issue is not truthfulness, but impact. Some ideas are dangerous not because they are false, but because they change how people see themselves. If humanity questions its origin, it questions authority. If it questions authority, institutions weaken. Stability relies on shared narratives, not just facts. This is the question that remains unanswered, not what the tablets say, but why reaction to them is so consistent, so coordinated, and so cautious. Until that question is addressed openly, suspicion will persist. Silence breeds imagination. Suppression amplifies curiosity. And so the knowledge resurfaces again and again, not demanding belief, but demanding explanation. As long as that explanation is withheld, the story will continue returning, because the most dangerous ideas are not the ones that are false, but the ones no one wants examined too closely. After centuries of speculation, suppression, and silence, one question remains stubbornly unresolved. Did the Knights Templar truly uncover humanity's origins, or did they merely glimpse fragments of a truth too vast to fully understand? The distinction matters. A glimpse can be dismissed as misinterpretation. Proof cannot. The Templars left no clear confession of discovery, no manifesto outlining what they found beneath Jerusalem. What survives are hints, reactions, and consequences. Their sudden rise, their unshakable confidence, and their violent erasure suggest they encountered something transformative. Yet transformation does not require complete understanding. Even partial revelation can alter belief. Perhaps the Templars recognized patterns without grasping their full meaning, ancient texts, unfamiliar symbols, narratives that did not align with Christian doctrine, enough to raise alarm, enough to demand papal attention, enough to make them dangerous. Or perhaps they understood far more than history allows. Perhaps they saw humanity's origin not as divine mystery, but as deliberate design. If so, their silence may not have been imposed alone. It may have been chosen. Some truths are not rejected because they are false, but because they are unbearable. The Templars may have stood at the edge of such a truth, uncertain whether crossing it would destroy faith or redefine it. In the end, the unanswered question is not what they found, but how much they knew, and whether humanity was spared revelation or denied it. Behind the walls of the Vatican, archives remain sealed, their contents inaccessible to historians and theologians alike. These are not forgotten documents or damaged scrolls. They are preserved, cataloged, and intentionally withheld. That distinction matters. Official explanations cite preservation, classification, and scholarly backlog. Yet these reasons fail to satisfy those who have spent decades denied access without clarification. When requests touch certain subjects, doors close. If the Vatican possesses ancient tablets, translations, or correspondence related to the Templars and pre-biblical knowledge, then history is incomplete by design. The archive becomes not a record, but a filter. What lies behind those doors may never be revealed, not because it no longer exists, but because releasing it would demand answers no institution is prepared to give. Faith, authority, and identity would all be forced into negotiation. The Vatican is uniquely positioned to decide what humanity is allowed to know about itself. That power is rarely acknowledged, yet deeply consequential. Sealed knowledge does not vanish. It accumulates pressure. Each generation denied access adds weight to the silence, and silence maintained long enough becomes suspicion. Whether the truth is benign or explosive no longer matters. What matters is that it remains hidden, and hidden truths, once suspected, never truly rest. If the sealed knowledge were released tomorrow, the world would not end in fire or chaos. Collapse would be quieter, slower. Faith systems would fracture unevenly. Some would reject the information outright. Others would reinterpret belief to accommodate it. History would undergo revision. Origin stories would be questioned. Authority would lose its monopoly on meaning. Humanity would be forced to confront itself not as a divine endpoint, but as part of a larger process. For some, this would be liberation. For others, existential loss. Meaning built on certainty would erode, replaced by ambiguity. Yet ambiguity is not emptiness. It is possibility. The release could also align long conflicting narratives. Science and myth might converge. Ancient stories could be reclassified as early records rather than fantasies. Humanity might finally accept itself as both created and evolving. And the fear lies not in destruction, but in adjustment. Institutions fear what they cannot control. Belief systems fear what they cannot explain. But history shows that suppression delays reckoning, it does not prevent it. When truth emerges after long concealment, its impact is amplified. The question is not whether humanity could survive revelation, it is whether it can survive perpetual uncertainty. Despite centuries of silence, the mystery endures. It resurfaces in texts, in art, in speculation, and in the quiet questions people ask when origin stories feel incomplete. Suppressed knowledge does not disappear. It waits. Each generation returns to the same fragments, the same anomalies, the same unanswered questions. The persistence itself is revealing. Truths without substance fade. This one does not. Perhaps the mystery remains because it is unfinished, not disproven, not resolved, simply paused. The Anunnaki tablets, the Templars, the Vatican archives all represent points along a chain of concealment. Each link suggests that something was encountered, evaluated, and deemed too disruptive for its time. Time, however, changes context. What once threatened collapse may now invite understanding. Humanity has grown more comfortable with uncertainty, more open to complexity. Some truths are not meant to arrive suddenly. They unfold when societies are ready to ask the right questions without demanding comforting answers. The mystery refuses to die because it was never meant to. It was meant to endure, to provoke, and to wait patiently for a moment when curiosity outweighs fear. And when that moment comes, history will not be rewritten. It will be completed.